as inertial slosh dampeners. Think of giant water shock absorbers. Pretty cool. Coming up on the left-hand side is this blue reflective glass office building. This is the Bank of America building, only recently finished construction about 3 years ago. Cost $800 million to build, and it completely replaced the 1950s office building that stood there before. They demolished it to make way for the Bank of America building. But before they tore it down, they took off these wavy aluminum panels from that 1950s office building. They dusted them off, they buffed them up, and they slapped them onto the front face of this building right at eye level for a little bit of architectural continuity. Once again, that idea of paying respect to the history of our city. Remember how we talked about the city requires a 30-foot setback from the river? Let's see how this building gets away with it. They created these 3 giant tripod legs that go from the base of the building all the way up to the 3rd floor to support the building, get the amount of office space they need, all while adhering to those rules. Now you might be thinking to yourself, Erica, what are you talking about? The next building's built right up against the river. That's because it was constructed before those rules were enacted. We're about to enter into what we like to call here at Shoreline, the time machine. Now why we call it that is the next 5 buildings we're going to be looking at, all on our right-hand side, are all built in chronological order. So we're going to decode these buildings. We're going to let them tell us a little bit more about society throughout each generation of architecture. So we're going to need our social scientist hats for this one. The first one coming up on the right is in that style of Art Deco, the style of the late 1920s, same style as Merchandise Mart. The streamlined verticality is in fact meant to be a metaphor for the upward mobility experience in the upper middle classes. You're still going to notice ornate designs on the front face of this building. However, they no longer are constructing buildings in that handcrafted European style. They're now using big, industrial, American man-made machines. After the Roaring 20s, the United States falls into the Great Depression and World War II. Now, because of this, there was virtually no large office buildings constructed around the United States from 1931 all the way to 1957. That's almost an entire generation lost of architecture. And when they rebooted it in the late 1950s, they stripped it down to its bare essential core to come up with black box modernism. This is Gateway Center 1 and 2. The next 2 buildings we're going to be looking at. They use cheap materials, steel frames, darkened windows. They're machines to work in, built for the working class. Our question today is that question out of curiosity. Why? So why were they creating buildings in such a cheap and simplistic style? That's because the architects grew up during the Great Depression, and they were used to being conservative and savvy with their money. They were too busy building the infrastructure of this country to be worrying about, oh, should we put a gargoyle here, some decorative metals there? No, they needed office buildings and they needed them fast. The father of this genre, his name is Mies van der Rohe, and he was the most influential architect of the 20th century. He spent a lot of time here in Chicago, and has a little phrase I bet you've used before: less is more. And that's exactly what these buildings are. He found the beauty in the simplicity of the design, the utility of the building. Moving right along into the 1970s, that's this white boxy looking office building. You can see some effects from black box modernism onto this next style, right? We're still in the box. This is known as international style. That's because it's non-site specific. You can find an office building like this really anywhere all over the world. Depending on where you're from, you might have seen an office building that looks something like that in your own hometown. As we groove our way into the 1980s, we are no longer in the box. In fact, we are out of the box. In the 1980s in the United States, it was a time of social change and social movement. And they wanted a style of architecture that reflected the changing values of our society. And that's when contextualism is born. That's this curved glass office building with the reflective glass. The curve in the glass represents the curve of the river. The reflective glass is meant to hold up a mirror to society, to teach us something about ourselves, to reflect who we are. The whole idea is these buildings don't want to stand apart, they want to stand together. As an overview of architecture throughout the generations, we start with that classic European style in the early 1920s, Art Deco in the late 20s, black box modernism in 1957, international style in the 70s, and contextualism is born in the 80s. The next building we're going to be looking at on our left-hand side here, I promise you, nobody was talking about this building 8 years ago until they spent $700,000 to be put on the map. And I mean that quite literally. They put a gigantic 2-scale grid of the downtown district of Chicago right there on the front face of their building. This is basically a humongous "you are here" map. That red brick represents where we are right now. So to help orient ourselves on this tour, what we did is we traveled down that main branch of the Chicago River, met up at Wolf Point, went up the north branch, made a U-turn, and now we're heading down the south branch. So that just helps us understand a little bit better about where we've been traveling along the river today. Coming up on the right-hand side, just past our contextualism beauty, is this concrete-looking building. You might recognize it from the 2008 Batman movie, The Dark Knight, from that original opening scene. Now what happens is the Joker's bad guys, they zip line down to rob Gotham Bank. The Joker then escapes in a school bus full of cash through the windows and gets away down Van Buren Street. What the Joker did not realize at the time, however, was he was actually robbing an abandoned post office. So that's what this building has been till about 2016, where they spent $900 million to reconvert it into tech office space. So today you're going to see companies such as Cisco and Uber all working out of this building. Chicago Fire 1871. Now, if you know anything about this story, you probably know something about a cow and a kerosene lamp. That all goes to answer the question, how did the fire start? But before we talk about the more playful myth, we're going to begin with the more tragic facts of the event. We'll give it a second. These bridges like to talk over me. 1871, October 8th, 9 p.m. on a Sunday. A fire breaks out in Chicago, and it was a perfect storm for a fire. What I mean by that is it's rumored tonight our city was poorly constructed out of wood. I'm talking everything was made out of wood. The streets were made out of wood, the sidewalks were made out of wood, the buildings were made out of wood. And to make matters worse, there happened to be 30-mile-per-hour winds that day. Now what this tornado, almost a vortex of fire that leapt across the Chicago River not once, but in fact twice. So you can imagine the scene. People were running for their lives as this tornado of fire was terrorizing the city. The fire raged on for 3 days, and what it left our city with was 17,500 buildings burnt down to the ground. 100,000 people were left without a place to work or home. 300 people lost their lives, and 3.5 square miles of this city were burnt down to the ground. That is to date the largest urban fire. Whew, okay. Now that we got all those tragic facts out of the way, we're going to talk a little bit more about the playful myth. So we're going to try to answer the question together, how did the Great Chicago Fire start? Now nobody knows the answer to this question, and that's where we get all great urban legends or urban myths, stemming from a question we cannot answer. But this is what we do know for facts. We know the fire started in Miss Catherine O'Leary's barn, which isn't too far from where we are right now. We know Miss Catherine O'Leary was an Irish immigrant, could do with why she was blamed. We know she had a cow, and we know the people of Chicago were angry. They were looking for escape. Cow, close. And so they blamed it on Miss O'Leary's cow, saying it purposely kicked over that kerosene lamp and started the Great Chicago Fire. Now, who knows if that story is true or they just made it up to sell more newspapers, but that's the way it goes here in this city. That fire is known as the worst and the best thing to happen in Chicago. It was the worst because the first city burnt down to the ground. What rose from its ashes was the second city. That's the city we're in and surrounded by today. That's partially where we get the nickname the Second City. This architectural boat tour wouldn't have been made possible without the Great Chicago Fire, because architects from all over the country moved to this great city to rebuild it, and they did just that. And within a half a generation, the architects got a little bit smarter and a little bit wiser, and they started to realize, I think wood is in fact flammable. And the first 10-story steel frame skyscraper was born right here in this city. They had done such a good job at rebuilding themselves that they were able to host the World Fair of 1893, bringing us to our second story. This was a huge deal for Chicago. It was their chance to put themselves back on the map, to prove they once again were a world-class city. So they put a young architect in charge of planning the campus for this fair. His name is Daniel Burnham. He's an important architect. We'll be talking more about him later on. And he created 220 temporary buildings in the south side of the lake in Jackson Park, in the classic European style, and he painted them white. It looked as if Venice, Italy was imported into Chicago and then painted white. You might have heard the book The Devil in the White City. That's what it's all referring to. This campus, it was meant to, ooh, that's a bee. It was meant to awe and inspire with its beauty. That's because Daniel Burnham comes from an architectural philosophy known as the Beautiful City Movement. Now get this, people in this philosophy, this school of thought, what they believe is that a beautiful city has the effect to inspire and dignify us. That we, in fact, are made better in society by the beauty that surrounds us. I don't know about you guys, but I definitely believe in this philosophy when I see the beautiful city of Chicago and the warm and welcoming people that live here. A few things debuted at that World Fair you might recognize today, such as Wrigley Chewing Gum, Cream of Wheat, Cracker Jacks, PBR won a blue ribbon going from Pabst to PBR, the spray paint can, the zipper, the dishwasher, and of course, George's Ferris wheel. Now this Ferris wheel is one of the first of its kind, and it was so big it could hold 1,200 passengers. It was meant to rival the Eiffel Tower in Paris. 27 million people from all over the world came to this fair. And what they saw was this beautiful campus created for them. They saw the first skyscraper. They saw George's Ferris wheel. And they left impressed. They said, whoa, Chicago really is a world-class city. And in fact, that fair did put them back on the map. But what it did more so is it created a hunger within the Chicago citizens. A hunger for more excellency, for more beauty. And so our city leaders, they said, hey Daniel, you did such a good job with that World Fair. We want you to reimagine Chicago. We want you to reconceptualize it. And he did just that, bringing us to our third and final story, Daniel Burnham's plan for the city. Here in Chicago, they've been city planning longer than any other city in the U.S., so they're pretty good at it. And Daniel, he wanted Chicago to be the Paris on the prairie. Think fountains, gardens, monuments, museums. He also wanted Chicago to be a city within a garden. And that's very different than a garden within a city, right? Completely different priorities. He wanted every single Chicago citizen to be in walking distance from a park. Today in Chicago, we have 613 parks. That is 9% of our land. Of the 246 neighborhoods here, the majority of them are named after the park they're next to, such as Lincoln Park. That's where I live. Also happens to be the largest park here in Chicago. That's 1.5 times bigger than New York City's Central Park, so that's a pretty big park. A few other things that are part of Daniel Burnham's plan you can check out around the city, such as Navy Pier, Buckingham Fountain, Grant Park. He had the original concept for the Riverwalk that wasn't constructed till 100 years later, the campus of our museums, and he extended the city grid to include 18 feet wide alleyways. Now, this might not seem very interesting or exciting to you, but if you're living in any other major U.S. city, you're putting your trash on the front street. Here in Chicago, all our trash goes in the back alleyways, keeping our city beautiful and clean. So I hope you can see how these three stories went together. We had a fire that destroyed, a fair that ignites or excites, and then a plan that beautifies. We're getting a good glimpse of some of that Chicago-style beauty right now, so I'm going to hop off mic one more time here. I'm going to let you enjoy